Okay, thanks. For about 20 years now, queer politics and queer theory has been quite a dominant strand in LGBT activism and, in fact, in radical LGBT activism. And I think that what's going to run through the talk I'm going to give is that means that we have to have a response to it which recognises that on the one hand these are a set of ideas which appeal to some of the people who are most radicalised around homophobia and transphobia, but we also have to say that these aren't Marxist ideas, and that therefore, while we have to relate to those people in a comradely way, we also have to argue against some of the aspects of those ideas because they don't provide the best way to take the struggle for LGBT liberation forward. I want to start just by giving people, I don't know how familiar with these works people are, so I just want to start by giving people a quick run through of a number of different books. This doesn't really constitute a reading list, but just to give you a sense of the kind of thing that is being written. For example, there's a well-known book by a woman called Eve Kosofsky-Sidgwick called Epistemology of the Closet. Straight in here we notice a big posh word like epistemology, very kind of literary and philosophical kind of writing. Sidgwick is writing here about relationships between men in literature which don't neatly fit into the division between gay and straight. She's also looking at language and how that works. If you look at David Halperin's 100 Years of Homosexuality, he's looking at the history of ancient Greece in societies where the division between gay people and straight people really doesn't operate at all, where all men of the ruling class at least are assumed to desire both women and teenage boys, and that there is no distinction between one kind of straight person and another kind of gay person. If you look at Matt Holbrook's book, Queer London, he's talking about the fact that as late as the 1950s, the concept of homosexuality, he argues, was a category that was limited or was used by middle class people, and that among working class Londoners, you have quite an acceptance of same-sex desire, but you have this distinction between queens who are effeminate and working class men who are referred to as trade, who have sex with women, but who will also have sex with men in return for favours, money, and so on. So he's talking about class and how class impacts on sexuality. If you look at the work of Judith, later Jack Halberstam, and her work Female Masculinity, she is talking about the history of butch women, a re-evaluation of LGBT history, talking about the bits which aren't respectable, in the sense that, in, for example, the book The Well of Loneliness, the main character is a woman called Stephen. The book writes a lot about her feelings of conflict and shame around her sexuality. She isn't a kind of, she isn't some kind of role model of, happiness and self-assertion and so on. And you can tell, of course, from Halberstam's name, that we're talking here about someone who in their own life has transitioned, that they've moved from the sex that they were assigned at birth to a different sex. Same is true of later Patrick Calithia, book called Speaking Sex to Power, and what Calithia is doing here is talking about forms of sexuality which aren't respectable, his history, for example, as a sex worker, but also talking about his history as a working class person, being raised as a lesbian Mormon in Utah, not an easy life to live, God knows, and his contempt for the way that working class people's experience is excluded in the LGBT movement. Michael Warner's book, The Trouble with Normal, I've almost finished with the books in case people worry that the whole meeting's going to be like this, is a polemic against respectable gay people, the kind of thing you get when sort of suited people are, you know, very nervously distancing themselves in embarrassment from drag and SM and public sex and leather, and, you know, want to, you know, and, you know, just sort of terrified of frightening the horses. And the final example that I'll give is a book by Michelangelo Signorile, which is called Queer in America. He's talking in the context of AIDS in the late 1980s, about militant demos, about forcing the American government to acknowledge the issue of AIDS, but also things like outing people, that is exposing as LGBT senior figures, you know, the kind of respectable, you know, powerful people, you know, figures in the Reagan government who were concealing their sexuality, and so on. So, I mean, these are the kind of books that are being written, the kind of issues that are being talked about with queer theory. Let me just sort of pull together some of the issues there. There is a questioning of the divide between gay and straight people, but also the divide between male and female, both in history and in society as it stands. There is a concern with a group of privileged and respectable LGBT people, and a fear that they are in some sense selling us out, in some sense taking us towards what's called assimilation, and there is much more of an identification with unrespectable people who are doing SM, who are doing sex work and so forth. There is a mixture of academic writing and activism. Some of this stuff is very hard to read. I'm going to talk about a writer called Judith Butler. I've read whole pages of Butler and thought, well, I understood nothing on that page, let's hope the next one goes better. Some of this is very wordy and academic and so forth. But the ideas, I think, that are in these texts do filter down to activists, and there's a kind of common sense version of them goes round. These are texts which are addressing issues which are of central interest to us as Marxists, which are talking about class, which are talking in some cases about imperialism and the way that LGBT people are invited to participate in imperialism, you know, by, there was a tweet from Stonewall the other week which referred to the fact that a homophobic law has been passed in Nigeria saying we will be contacting the Foreign Office about this, you know. So Stonewall's vision of what they want to do is that they want to side with the Foreign Office, you know, to knock the Nigerians into line. And this is the kind of thing that gets written about in queer theory, and these are very interesting things, I think, that we as Marxists are also interested in, as well as the great anger which I think is reflected against homophobia and transphobia in a lot of queer theory writing. And I think finally what we have in common with a lot of this writing is a vision of a society which is radically different. That it isn't just a question, of course we want LGBT people to have formal legal equality, but we want actually something more than that. We want a society where the divisions that exist in ours between straight people and LGBT people, the kind of stereotypes which constrain the lives of women and men, are completely got rid of. So those are some of the issues, and I hope you can see that these are things that at one level we should be sympathetic to. But we also, I think, you know, do have some issues and some questions with these writings, and I want to talk about two of the key figures in queer theory to make the thing clear. The first is Michel Foucault, a French historian of political ideas, a public intellectual, a gay man, a political activist, particularly in the 1970s around issues to do with prisons. Foucault died in the 1980s, and towards the end of his life, he wrote a book which, depending on the translation you read, is either called The Will to Know, or The Will to Knowledge, or The History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And what Foucault says here is that sex is not just about biology, that actually sex changes in history, so that before the 19th century, he points out, there is no such category in society as homosexual and heterosexual people. And since Foucault wrote that book, there's been an immense number of historical works written which actually demonstrate that that's the case. And just to give you one example, there's a book by an author called Michael Rock. He writes about 15th century Florence. The evidence shows, we know from the court records of that time, that 2/3 of the men in Florence were implicated in sex with other males by the time they reached the age of 40. And he looks at how people led their lives. As teenagers, they start off having sex with young men in their 20s. In their 20s, they carry on having sex with other males, but they have it now with younger men, and there are social norms about what sex acts it's appropriate for the two partners to do. And at some point, in his 30s or his 40s, the man marries. By the time a man gets to be in his 50s or 60s, same-sex acts are seen to be, you know, something you should have left behind earlier on. Particularly being penetrated is something which is completely inappropriate to the dignity of an older man. But there is here in this society no distinction between straight people and gay people. The desire for different sexes is built into the life experience of a large number of people. And the research indicates that this is the case in a whole number of societies, and not just that the division between straight and gay is particular to our society, but that the whole putting together, as we do in our society, of certain body parts, certain desires, certain pleasures, certain acts, of putting all of these together in a box labelled sexuality, and that this category is central to an individual personality, is an idea that's specific to capitalism, to the way that we conceive of ourselves since Freud, to an idea of the individual, which is very specific to capitalist society, and so forth. You actually look, for example, at evidence of how medieval monks thought about this kind of thing, and nuns, then you find that while on the one hand they reject, you know, this is a society in which for the sin of same-sex acts you can be burned at the stake. So, you know, it's not a kind of, it isn't a tolerant society in any way. But you actually have, for example, a medieval monk describing what spiritual friendship is like. And he says of a spiritual friend, he says that you alone will converse sweetly and secretly with him alone. He says you alone will confer with him alone, and as the bustle of the world is silenced, in the sleep of peace, in the embrace of love, in the kiss of unity, with the Holy Spirit flowing between you, you alone will rest with him alone. Thus you will join and unite yourself to him and mix your soul with his. Now, he isn't talking about sex, he isn't talking about genital sex, so this isn't exactly gay, but on the other hand, I don't think, you know, people who made such statements in our society, I don't think men who made such statements, you know, would, you know, find it easy to maintain a heterosexual identity, so it's not, you know, it's not straight either. In the same way, there's a public letter which one nun writes to another in the convent of Tegernsee in Germany. She writes a verse letter to her friend, as I say, a public letter. Her friend is away from the convent. She writes, I shed tears as I used to smile, and my heart is never glad. When I recall the kisses you gave me, and how with tender words you caressed my little breasts, I want to die because I cannot see you. So this is something which isn't a terrible sin because it doesn't involve the genitals. To us it seems sexual, it wasn't like that in the Middle Ages. Now, what the jargon which then gets to be used to talk about this fact that sexuality exists in history is to say that sexuality is socially constructed. You know, this is the jargon. And I think that's something that fits quite well with the vision that we have of the change that we want to see, that we're not just about fighting for civil rights for a fixed minority of LGBT people, but we're fighting for a transformation of society in which you're not put into a social category on the basis of the people you desire. So I think this is, you know, so I think that this is a, you know, crucially important insight here, but I think there is also, you have to say, a problem with it, because Foucault is arguing that sexuality changes in history, but he doesn't say the most crucial thing, which is how or why. it changes. And the French Marxist Sartre said this about Foucault, that he provides you with a series of still pictures. He provides you with a before and after. But what he doesn't do is to talk about how things change from one to the other. And this actually isn't an accident. Foucault is, his whole approach is, to use a philosophical term, idealist, by which we mean that it's centrally to do with ideas and not to do with the material reality of society. And Foucault himself explicitly locates the development of the homosexual category in the 19th century, he says, because he wants to separate it from the rise of capitalism earlier on. So he's actually consciously separating it from broader developments in society. We have to do the exact opposite. We have to look at how, for example, the development of wage labour in capitalism creates the concept of a private life, an area outside of work where you can do what you like. We have to look, for example, how urbanisation in the 17th century with the rise of capitalism creates a space in cities like London where you first see the development of LGBT subcultures. We have to look at how the concerns of the Victorian ruling class around the family, and of course the family is absolutely crucial to this whole area, because we have to understand that the reason why LGBT people are oppressed is because the ruling class is very concerned to have the next generation of workers reproduced, because that's how they maintain their profitability, and they are concerned about any sexual practices or any practices around gender which they feel undermine that. You can actually see that process developing in the 19th century as the ruling class reinforce the family and the hope that they will be able to stabilise capitalism in that way. And so you see the emergence of the concept of the homosexual with the laws against gay sex that are passed in 1885, the trials of Oscar Wilde in 1895, and so on. So there are these real problems in Foucault, and they're reflected, I would argue, in predominant idealism in later queer theory, that there are lots of texts which are doing close textual analysis in a very academic way and which don't relate them to the surrounding society. But still there's a large number of texts here which provide historical evidence which we can use if we build it into a broader Marxist framework, and so which help us to actually give an account of the history of sexuality. Now I want to move on and talk about a second writer who is called Judith Butler, still alive, an American academic, a philosopher, as I say, sometimes hard to read, though that's true, God knows, of all philosophers, well, was certainly quite a few in my experience. Butler is Jewish. She's a supporter of BDS, of boycott, disinvestment and sanctions, has got quite a lot of crap for that off, right-wingers and Zionists and so on. She came down, spoke at Occupy Wall Street, and she writes a book in the 1990s called Gender Trouble. And Butler is looking at how gender works. How is it that in society some people are recognised as men, some people as women? And she's rejecting what was a very dominant strand in the 1980s feminism, which is to argue that women can be regarded as a kind of monolithic, undifferentiated grouping, some kind of sisterhood. She's arguing against that. And this reflects really a common sense view in society that gender is pretty straightforward, and at the end of the day you're either one thing or the other, and there you are. And Butler asks the question, how is it that people are recognised in society as women or as men? And she answers that this is because people generally perform in ways which are considered appropriate to their gender, and that lots of social norms pressure us to do this. And in talking about this, she uses, and I need to introduce the jargon because there's some confusion around this, she uses some jargon from the philosophy of language. Where there's a distinction made between two sorts of speech acts. There are constative speech acts, which seek to describe the world. This is a bottle of water, I'm speaking of Marxism, and so on. And then what are called performative speech acts, which aren't necessarily true or false, but which seek to change the world. So I now pronounce you husband and wife, I promise to phone you tomorrow, you know, and so on and so forth. And she says that when people talk about being a man or a woman, that's largely a matter of performative. It's largely what we would call ideology. She's saying that gender is not something you are, it's something you do. That in the sense that my being a man is not about my standing in front of you and expressing some inner masculine essence. It's that I have learned how to perform masculinity because I've been socialized in this society, and that if I have an inner sense of masculinity, then that comes from the outside in rather than from the inside out. And whereas some earlier writers had distinguished between sex, which they said is a biological thing, and gender, which they said is a social phenomenon, then Butler says that statements about being a man or a woman are almost always statements about gender. Butler does not deny, she argues, the material reality of the body, but as I say, she feels it's mostly ideological. And I think you can, on the one hand, see some elements of truth in this, but I think there's a huge problem with it. I think that it's certainly the case that sex is not as straightforward as, you know, men over here, women over here. I mean, one of the issues which has become part of the LGBT movement in the last 20 years is the political struggle of trans people, but also you look around the world, you look around history. If you want to look at India, then you've got an estimated population of 200,000 people who are born as men but are living in some sense as women, as hijras, in religious communities. I was talking to an Indian colleague at work. She's saying, yeah, we go back to the Punjab because how hijra live is that they come round when people have a baby, and, you know, they dance and play musical instruments, and they demand to be paid for this, and they make quite realistic assessments of how much people are worth. And Harjit was saying, you know, Hijra comes up to her sister-in-law and goes, you know, you're quite wealthy, aren't you? You're living in England, we'll have that gold chain you've got on, thank you very much. And there's a process of bargaining goes on. And as I say, this is, you know, this is 200,000 people are living in this way. The music, which some of you will have heard as you came in, is from a Handel opera called Ariadante. Almost all Handel operas include roles for castrati, for men who are castrated so as to maintain high voices. So the history of our culture and other cultures around the world do include a whole number of people who haven't lived their lives either as men or women. And there's also the experience of what's called intersex people, which is people whose bodies don't fit neatly into those categories, who are actually far more numerous than you might expect. I mean, one estimate is that as many as 1 in 100 people is intersex in some sense, and those people quite often face appalling oppression. So, for example, a baby boy whose penis is judged to be too small will have it removed and a vagina created and so on, without obviously as a baby they're being able to have any say about that. I think also the idea that it's all cultural, this stuff about men and women, is something which really fits with the social changes of the last 40 years of men and women working together in offices where it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. And I think particularly in certain areas like being a student or being being an academic, that is particularly true. I think what Butler is doing in undermining a kind of 1980s style of feminism, which saw, you know, men over here and women over here, and precisely because they had that vision of things, that there is this very rigid divide between the sexes. I mean, that's why you get some sort of 1980s style feminists being so horribly transphobic, because their version of feminism is that you side with the sisterhood, and anybody who troubles the boundaries between men and women is, something which they don't like at all. So I think that we have to recognise that that's quite a positive aspect to it. And finally, I think you do have to recognise that there is a level of ambiguity in people's experience of gender. On the one hand, you're told it's all dead simple and you're either one thing or the other. But clearly people worry, for example, that when men have erectile dysfunction, they worry that they're not fully a man. When women have to have mastectomies because of illness, they worry that they've lost their femininity. Women are constantly, constantly exhorted, to wear certain clothes and behave in certain ways, otherwise they're not being feminine and so on. So there is this real sense of gender being policed and having to fit in. And I think Butler speaks to all these things. And I think that there is, in that sense, you can see why her arguments are persuasive. But I think that we do have to say that there's a huge gaping hole in it, in that she overemphasises the importance of ideology. She talks very little. In theory, she hasn't forgotten it, but in practice, she doesn't talk about it. The material reality of the body, because a key aspect of the material reality of the body is of great interest to the rulers of our society, which is that certain human beings are capable of giving birth. And the reason why they're interested in that, as I say, is because they want to maintain capitalism, they want to maintain the working class, the next generation of workers. And it's because of that that trans oppression and LGB oppression is rooted in capitalism and tied to capitalism. And you can only understand how we can change society if you understand that the crucial thing that we have to do is to change the material reality of the situation. Because I think what you quite often get with people who are keen on Butler is that they think in terms of ideology, of changing people's ideas, of subverting ideologically notions of masculinity and femininity. There is an enthusiasm for drag, for example. And I think we have to say that you have to understand that ideas about gender are rooted in materiality, so that, of course, it can be interesting and fun to explore those things, but that actually you have to challenge the material reality that underlies them if you want to make a difference. Now, I just want to, before I go any further, talk about the use of the word queer, because I know that for some comrades, this is, quite striking and worrying that a word that they've heard used as hate speech is being used by these people. I think that if you look at how this works, I think it's something that we can't agree with, but I think you can see why it happens. I think that there's a t-shirt which says, not gay as in happy, but queer as in fuck you. And I think that what people are doing when they use the word queer is articulating their sense of anger, their awareness of homophobia, their sense of exclusion, their defiance at that exclusion, and in fact seeking to make queer into a banner for all of the excluded. Because a second aspect of the appeal of queer, I think, is that the alternative is LGBT. And LGBT, while it's good because it seeks to include a range of people, is not really something you can chant on a demo, or something. It's like an abbreviation on a form or something, and so it doesn't have that emotional heft behind it. But for all that, I think there is a real problem in the word queer, and it was made particularly plain, I think, in a debate. I'm on the mailing list of an organisation called Queer Resistance, which is a kind of UK uncut grouping in London, and they had an email from a young man who said, I think what you're doing, fighting the cuts and so on, is great, but that it causes real problems for me that you use the word queer, because I work in a hotel kitchen in York, and where I work, the word queer is an insult. The word queer is hate speech. And I think that we do have to appreciate that I do think that the word queer is used in quite narrow milieu quite often. And it is used in the academies, it is used on the gay scene, it is, I mean, there's also the element of it being trendy and like queer eye for the straight guy and queer as folk and all that kind of thing. But it's used in these quite narrow range of places where you can be sure, or you can be fairly confident, that it's not being used as hate speech and so you can use it, but that neglects the fact that for the vast majority of people, particularly working class people in this country, it is hate speech, and we have to have that broader perspective because we want to reach out to the vast majority of straight people and draw them into activity around this. So it's interesting to me in the regard of this debate that none of the union groups, you know, now virtually all of the trade unions have LGBT groups. They call them that. They don't call them queer groups or LGBTQ groups and so on. And I think that that's the position that we have to adopt in the SWP, that you know, that it isn't a word we can use. I mean, finally, I guess, to talk about another aspect of queer theory, and you have to root this in the change which has happened in the experience of LGBT people, particularly around the issue of class. Because if you look back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, then there were a whole number of things which LGBT people had in common. Until 67 in England and Wales, then any gay man could be sent to prison. I mean, it was mostly working class men, but it was a risk that faced anybody. If you look at the early 80s, when AIDS appears, then that is an illness which affects people across any kind of class divide. But what you now have, you of course always have had middle-class LGBT people, particularly middle-class gay men. The phenomenon I'm describing is particularly true of gay men. But that what you now have is it wasn't possible 20 or 30 years ago to be an out executive in a multinational. It wasn't possible to be an out senior police officer and so on. And what you're seeing, I think, is the development of an out LGBT middle class, and in some cases ruling class. So Tim Cook is the chief executive of Apple, and he is an out gay man, and he's the highest paid chief exec in the world on $378 million a year. And if that's your position in society, the last thing you want is the end of capitalism, isn't it? You know, you're going to see LGBT politics as a matter of gaining equality with straight people within the system. You're quite happy with categories like LGBT and straight. You don't want to, you know, you don't want to mess up categories like men and women. You're not interested in any kind of broader social change. You have this very narrow view of what LGBT politics is about. But for the vast majority of LGBT people, that's not how it is. For the rest of us, for students who are having to rely on support from home because of the cuts, the fact that 1 in 12 LGB students and 1 in 6 trans students is estranged from their family, so they can't rely on that support, that's a class question, and it leads them, I think, to see LGBT oppression not just as a single issue within society, which is the only thing that needs changing, but as only one example of what a crap society we live in, and it's connected to all of the other crap that goes on, and it can lead them to think we need more general social change. Now that's the argument that we put forward, that this is about class. But you also get authors like people like Michael Warner who have a concern about respectability. And this is subtly different, and the difference is crucial. Because Warner polemicises, for example, against, as he puts it, men who are at home making dinner for their boyfriends. And this is against, to some extent, people not being politically active. But there's also this idea that if you're living a kind of quiet, respectable, domestic life, you know, as opposed to, I don't know, being out, you know, fist fucking on a building site or whatever, you know, whatever people are supposed to do, then, you know, then you're letting the side down because you're being insufficiently radical. And there is this idea that certain forms of sexuality, there is this idea that certain forms of sexuality are radical. We have to be quite clear. There are certain forms of sexual expression which the Daily Mail doesn't like. You know, SM and group sex and so on and so forth. If getting to socialism was simply a matter of having enough of the right kinds of sex, it would be a relatively simple matter, wouldn't it? We have to be clear that while people may get harassed by the state to a certain extent for doing SM and so on. There is actually nothing in those forms of sexuality which undermines capitalism. And in fact, you have to go further, because there is a kind of acceptance and glorification of a kind of sexual bohemian approach to these things, a kind of praise of, that there are no real problems with sex work, there are no real problems with porn, and the kind of reduction of human sexuality to money that we see in those things. Because actually, those things are actually not. They aren't things which undermine accepted social values. There's a long tradition of these things being actually the flip side of accepted social values, the semi-permitted underside of accepted bourgeois normality, and we have to be absolutely clear about that. The other thing that you get in Warner and other authors is a concern that the respectable privileged minority will sell us out, and what will happen is that we will become, in their word, assimilated. Now, what we're being assimilated into, quite often we're being assimilated into what they call straight society. Now, of course, we have to defend LGBT people, we have to defend people's right to organise by themselves if they want to, but we have to be absolutely clear that the problem is not straight people, because the vast majority of straight people in our society have absolutely no control over the kind of values which typify that society, and most straight people have absolutely no interest, and in fact, from day to day, have no concern in keeping LGBT people down. What is in the interest of straight workers is to unite with LGBT workers and change the world so that we have a society of sexual liberation for everyone. So we have to reject any idea that this is either about lifestyles or that it's about the problem being straight, and we have to say that this is actually about class and about politics. And the problem with Stonewall is not that they wear suits, the problem is that they don't take on board trans oppression, and the problem is that 2 weeks ago they had a conference about fighting homophobia in education where they invited Michael Gove along, for God's sake. And that it's the class politics that are the problem. And I'll just finish by saying, if you actually look back at history, then you see when workers move into struggle, it's that opens up the possibility of real social change, because it's that leads people to start questioning these ideas. In the miners' strike, when the group Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners collected around the gay clubs and then went down to the valleys, they were able to win people over. It didn't happen immediately, but at the end of the miners' strike, you have a miners' brass band at the start of the Gay Pride March. The NUM passes policy in support of gay rights. It becomes the common sense of the movement, and then when the Labour government gets into power in 1997, far more slowly than you'd like, but eventually, because this is the common sense of the movement, all of this the laws are changed and we get formal equality. That is because of workers' struggle. The same is true in South Africa. The reason why LGBT rights, or the rights at least of lesbians and gays, are included in the constitution was because apartheid was swept away by a huge wave of worker struggle, which opened up the possibility of talking about a new South Africa where there wasn't just racial equality, but where there was justice around gender. And of course the final example, and the one you have to always come back to, is the example of the October Revolution in 1917, where despite the horrible backwardness of the semi-medieval backwardness of Russia, where it isn't just that being gay is against the law, but if you're convicted for same-sex acts, part of your punishment is that you have to do penance in a monastery. That's what Russia was like in 1917. In October 1917, all of those laws are swept away, and the working class regime led by the Bolsheviks actually institutes a whole new world around sexuality, looking to the most modern ideas in Europe at the time. Those are the examples that we need to look to. So we need to relate to people and talk to people who are influenced by queer theory, but we also need to say to them that there are all kinds of ideas in there which we need to reject, and we need to put in a comradely way. We need to, as in the phrase of Lenin, we need to patiently explain the difference between queer theory and Marxism, and that at the end of the day, it's Marxism which has the answers.
Yeah, I wanted to start where Colin finished off. What I thought was a good talk, which was last night. I had the great privilege, really, of listening to one of the founder members of Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners at the meeting on the miners' strike, which was an absolutely brilliant meeting. It was very interesting for me as well, because it's something I've often spoken about in, LGBT, SWP branch meetings and so on, not heard a lot of the detail and so on. But partly it was the scale of what they did. They organised gigs that raised £5,500 for the miners and so on. They did collections outside Gays the Word bookshop, outside nightclubs and all of this kind of thing. But it was actually the description of when they took that money and they took that solidarity to the miners in the South Wales coalfield, and they describe a bunch of, I think it was 7 of them, 10 of them, driving up to the Miners' Welfare Centre. That sense of nervousness in what turns out to be a 7-hour journey because they get lost because there's no lights in the valley, sort of thing. And then, that sense of expectation, not knowing what to expect. And obviously, you have to remember what the period is. That this is a time when, they've only just discovered that HIV is the virus that causes AIDS, that the right-wing press are absolutely on the offensive, that the tabloid newspapers are putting out things like AIDS, the gay plague, and all that. People are really under attack here, and they do not know what to, a mainly male workforce and so on that you're going bringing solidarity to, is that they walk into the Miners' Welfare Club, which is jammed to the rafters with 3 generations of miners' family, and they say it goes quiet, and there's this eerie silence in the room, and then what happens is 2 or 3 people stand up, they start clapping, and the whole room just erupts. And the way that the comrade described it, he said that whole question, of homophobia and oppression, he said it just melted away. And when Colin talks about those examples in history, when we're taking on the question of queer theory, that's the ground on which we have to take it on, actually, those kind of examples. And why is that so important to us in Britain? Actually, that's a big deal. The trade unions and their attitudes to LGBT liberation, as they stand inside of Britain, were transformed by lesbians and gays support the miners. No question about it. It was as Colin said, it was the NUM that moved the motion of the TUC, which was the most progressive the most progressive policy that the TUC had ever had around the question of LGBT rights. And it transformed the landscape inside of Britain. In a similar way, we have to come back to actually what Stonewall actually means. Colin described the problems of Stonewall as an organisation. We have to reclaim it as Stonewall was a riot, as they say, that it was actually part and parcel and unimaginable. And the last point, unimaginable without the struggles that were going on in the 60s at the time, without the Black Civil Rights movement, without the student revolt that went around the world in 1968, without the struggles against the Vietnam War movement. So just to underline what Colin says, that the major breakthroughs in the struggle for LGBT liberation are when the class is moving forward and the class is fighting back against the ruling class.
Hey, I have to confess that I've always actually been almost quite seduced by queer politics, because it, on paper, actually sounds lovely, especially because of using the term queer, because LGBT is limited as a term. It doesn't include asexuals, it doesn't include people who are polyamorous, it doesn't include people who are more than one thing, unfortunately. But it is, so things like queer and queer theory can be very, very seductive in that sense, but its limitations do become very, very obvious at times. And the biggest example I can think of is the rampant sexism within biphobia, which is the idea that all bi men are actually gay and all bi women are actually straight, in both senses they all want to sleep with men. And it's so apparent within the LGBT community that the B is sort of left out a little bit over here and not really accepted. And you find that within a lot of queer ideas as well, there's still a certain amount of sleeping with the enemy idea. It doesn't actually break it down, talk about the reasons why these things exist, and talk about solidarity, which is how, as it has been said, you do see progress. So whereas I am quite sympathetic to those who enjoy the term queer and like the idea of queer politics, its limitations are just so ridiculous that we do have to look further.
Jonathan Neal, an extra point about those South Wales miners, because I've talked to South Wales miners about that moment, is if you have 300 miners and their families in the welfare club, and the lesbian and gay supporting the miners people come through the door, something like 100 or 150 of those 300 people, there's somebody in their family that they're very fond of or that they love, who they know is lesbian or gay. And those are the three people who first start clapping are among those people. And the enormous emotional force of the moment is not because some bunch of strangers have come into the room, but because something that is in us and is ours, of which we have had to be concealing and ashamed sometimes, can now be celebrated. That's the really important thing about that movement. I thought it was a wonderful talk, Colin. I'd like to disagree a little bit about two things where maybe you do agree. Building on an article that Nancy Lindisfarne and I have written for the ISJ. One is about the importance of the material reality of the body. The material reality of the body is enormously important. Gender is enormously important socially, and gender inequality is enormously important socially because it plays on the enormous importance of living inside sexual bodies. But what isn't materially important is the difference between the male and the female body. In the 17th century, there's an odd thing. In the 17th century in England, also in New England, it was most people believed that it was impossible to conceive unless the woman had an orgasm during sex. The reason they believed this was that they knew perfectly well that women almost always had orgasms during sex. And there's a wonderful account in Pepys' diary of having sex with a woman where both he and she were very concerned that she not get pregnant. So they tried desperately all the way through to make sure that she didn't come, and at one point he thought she had, and because she seemed very excited, and he inquired, and she said, no, it's still all right. And they got through it without coming, and there was such relief. And medical textbooks in the period would have a picture of the male genitals and the female genitals, and then underneath it would say, isn't it astonishing how very similar they are? It's not, because the particular way that, no, I'll skip that. What I want to go on to say, though, is the material reality that is deep behind gendered inequality is the material reality of capitalism. If you look, a separate women's labor is important sometimes in capitalism. It's rarely important in other forms of class society, which still have great inequality. In most forms of class society, in most villages in the world, the care of children is shared, and the work of the farm is shared, and yet there is still massive inequality in gender. And if you want to look for it, you have to look for it that the people the ruling class who want to have inequality in every respect, want us to have inequality in gender because it convinces us that inequality is natural.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that I could talk about. What Jonathan just said was fascinating. A lot of what Colin said was very interesting. You know, we could even talk about what we might want to do on building sites. But actually, I do kind of want to come back a little bit just to that question of vocabulary, because I do think it's quite important. And I wanted to give a bit of an illustration, actually, from my workplace of when, of where actually using the word queer was quite important, because we had a training session a couple of weeks ago where this man who I work in a library who has done a lot of work on LGBT equality in libraries came, and he kind of did this basic thing about who LGBT people are, and this is why you might want to be nice to them in the library and whatever. And then he was quite dismissive about the word queer. People asked, are there letters on the end of LGBT now? Isn't there queer? Isn't there bi? Isn't there these kind of things? And he was just like, oh, queer, it's just this thing, it doesn't really mean anything, you can be anything if you're queer, you know, some people like to call themselves that, but it's only really an American thing, you know, it's not very important. And actually, one of my colleagues was then able to stand up and say, well, actually, no, I define as queer, and that's not what I think queer means. For me, queer is actually, you know, a political choice. She actually talked about some of the way that she felt about being queer, you know, in the workplace and today's society. And I think that was quite significant. And I think that while it is definitely true, the experience that Colin was talking about the man who works in the hotel in York, who still sees it as, you know, hate speech, I think there are also a number of people who actively, we know it's actively choose to define as queer, and for whom it's very important. And I do worry slightly that by not including that word in the name of our organisations and things like that on the left more generally, that we are excluding people who are, in some cases, you know, very political, very radical people, and people who, you know, we want to be working with and things like that. So I just kind of want to put that forward as a suggestion, I guess.
I've got to say, in my workplace, if they ever heard the word queer used, I don't think it'd be, you know, people using it in a complimentary fashion. My ex used to talk, you know, a black guy used to talk about us nigger browns, and I said, you know, you can't use that word in public because that gives confidence to the racist. It's not, you know, you may use it as a self-identity thing. I feel very uncomfortable with it. You know, even you using it just with me, but you cannot use it in public because that, you know, that is something that we haven't reclaimed from the racists yet. You know, it's not a term of affection. You can, you know, within your community maybe, but you know, in public, and he was quite loud and just so to say. And then, you know, a few years later, he did start using the word packy, and I did point out to him that you really can't. You know, and he worked at the job centre in Leeds, and obviously, you know, after 7/7, there was, you know, quite a lot of anti-Muslim racism. Like actually after 9/11, an awful lot of people lost their jobs. You had loads of motivations coming into the job centre then. But you know, I said, you know, if you give it, you know, it's not about, you know, if you want to try and reclaim it, I prefer alternative sexualities, but maybe it's a bit too late to try and think of something where LGBT's been that widely accepted. But now, in terms of liberation, I mean, last week I was on a delivery and actually went into, you know, Chariots. I think it's 19 quid apparently the entrance fee now. I mean, how many working class people can afford to go? You know, it's a gay sauna north of Liverpool Street, or a chain of them. You know, I also had to deliver to a shop called Expectations. I never knew this was like a sex fetish shop. God's, it's not cheap. I couldn't afford to be buying anything in there really. You know, so, you know, things you do for work, eh? No, seriously. In terms of rights at work, we have an awful lot of rights. But if you look at what's happened recently, they're now going to charge to register employment tribunal claims. Now, this has a massive impact on working people, and it doesn't just affect the LGBT people. It affects women. It affects all the equality strands, disabled, black, religious, you know, people with religious backgrounds. So you have to look at, what does queer theory have to say about that, and how do we fight together? Because Lord Brown, you know, was the chair of BP, he wouldn't be supporting us, you know, having free access to employment tribunals. His interests are not the same as ours. When you look at actually how struggle changes things, another more recent example is South Africa, where you actually have LGBT rights written into the constitution, but just because you have the right doesn't mean that you've won it in society. And obviously we know there are enormous problems with the so-called corrective rape of lesbians in South Africa. My own personal experience is that when I was out at work in the 90s and got, you know, Hope We Die 80 fag blasted every single day, because there was no legal protection back then, when the manager sacked me, everyone supported me against the management. That cinema had been open 7 years. I got my job back with their support, and the homophobia died down afterwards because they realised that we have something more in common. And that's something that queer theory can never explain, and that is how you start fighting for liberation. And that's, you know, that's a really concrete example. I think, you know, when we fight together, we can start breaking down these ideas, and queer theory can't do that.
I'm from Australia, and we have a really, quite a kind of interesting and hidden history of workers' struggle being key in the struggle for liberation for GLBT people. And one of the most important aspects of that is actually happened in the 70s. So we had a really militant union, the BLF, the Builders and Labourers Federation, who had a series of green bans across New South Wales, which said our workers will not work on these sites that are bad for the environment. So as a result of that, we actually, you know, that we saved very important and key kind of iconic green spaces in Sydney. But equally as important was the pink bands that they actually put on Macquarie University, which is a big university in New South Wales, when the university expelled a student from college for being gay. And that was something that wasn't easy, that didn't happen easily. There was an argument in the union about that. There were homophobic ideas expressed, but they were challenged, and actually we won. There was a pink band placed on this university, and that student was reinstated in his original position. And I think this is an incredibly inspiring story, and it really, I mean, it's quite similar, though on a much smaller scale, to the story here about the miners. But it's an incredibly inspiring story and tells us so much about how we can win liberation and how that process goes hand in hand and is intrinsically a part of, you know, the process, the working class struggle and the struggle against class society and capitalism.
I'm a Unison branch secretary, and the year before last, someone came to our union annual general meeting with a motion asking the branch to affiliate to the group Queers Against the Cuts, which is an anti-austerity group, which maybe Colin will talk about a bit in the summing up. And I have only ever come across the term as hate speech. And I looked at that and I thought, I'm not sure about this. Talked to our qualities officer, who said, talk to Colin. And I basically got a rather shortened version of Colin's talk, which was very instructive. I thought, you know, I cannot, as a branch secretary, stand up and say against two LGBT people who are arguing for this that actually I don't think we should support the group because I think the term is used in wider society as hate speech. Necessarily, if they're going to, if they are comfortable with arguing for that and think that that is acceptable in the wider movement, then I have to accept that judgment, and I have to accept that my ideas about language, the world has moved on from the linguistic world, if you like, that I grew up in. At the same time, and we also have to, you know, at the same time, also when I was having that conversation, Colin, I also said, well, you know, but we don't extend that to talking about the reason for union LGBT groups to be renamed, do we? And I think that's equally okay. I think that's equal, because the truth is that we also, at the same time, as understanding that language has fundamentally changed for people who are new coming into the struggle, the truth is that also that hasn't changed for everyone. Now that change is, you know, very, very probably going to come. Hopefully, the term ceases to be hate, you know, the term will one soon cease to be hate speech, and will simply have a positive connotation. At that point, we can happily do that. But the truth is, until that point, we do have to remember that it's something worth fighting with, but also against.
I'm David from Lucha in Barcelona. Some time back we had a very interesting branch meeting about intersex with an intersex activist, and we had some articles in our magazine. It's obviously an issue you have to take on, but then you have to say, well, LGBTI, which gets longer. Second telegram, about the queer as an acceptable term. If it's a label, previous comment said, if it's a label that you put on yourself, then if you're oppressed for putting on the label, well, you change the label. Whereas I think gay oppression is an oppression for what you are. You can't just change the label and avoid that oppression. So I think that the argument he put is slightly doubtful. On the question of gay marriage, in Spain there is now gay marriage as such. I'm not sure about the churches, but you can actually get married. It's not simply a civil union. And obviously in France it's a thing that has agitated and annoyed massively the right and the fascists, and I think therefore it's something we defend, whatever criticism we have of marriage as an institution. And I think possibly the queer theory would be less dialectical on that. Finally, a question, and relating possibly to something that Jonathan said before, about the material basis of gender and with reproduction. In Spain and Catalonia there's a big fashion currently for Silvia Federici, who wrote a book about the witch hunt and so on, and talking about the importance of reproduction and somehow a parallel dialectic and series of contradictions and so on, which personally doesn't convince me, but other people seem to be very interested in that. But I think compared to the idea that gender is purely ideology, obviously there is that biological aspect as well as the work aspect that Jonathan mentioned, and of course capitalism does need new workers to produce profits, and workers actually currently come out of the uteruses of women. So, can you speak about that?
Yeah, just a couple of brief points. I mean, the first one about the use of the word queer, I think it all really comes down to context. In the same way as I don't like using the word, for example, the word nigger. If it is used, it is entirely different if it is used by the head of Aryan Nations in the United States, as opposed to being used by Richard Pryor or Chris Rock, etc. It is contextualised. And I think we actually have to, if people feel comfortable with it being militant about it, that's fine, but you've actually got to respect the issue of actually the use of it within the workplace, which is an entirely different context. I think a couple of the points, I mean, the miners' strike was mentioned, and the one thing I do remember about the miners' strike, a couple of things, was the leaflet which came out from lesbians and gay support the miners. First leaflet I saw which said, "Your fight is our fight. If you are defeated, they will come for us." And we didn't actually realise at the time exactly how present that was, that with the smashing of the miners, 3 years later, we got Clause 28, the biggest backlash of all. One of the problems I actually do have with queer theory is that I actually think that the first Pride I ever went on, which was in '79, I think, the Nazis were on the run through the Anti-Nazi League. We basically rubbished Labour's incomes policy. And I remember being with 300 people in a muddy field. I thought, this is amazing, gay pride money. 300 people there. And there was Kokomo doing We Are Family, and there's a sense that it was going to go onwards and upwards, and we did not actually realise that Thatcher and AIDS and all these other things were waiting in the wings. And although I was actually quite historically literate, it is important to remember, and I don't see this in queer theory, that history has a reverse gear. And in Europe at the moment, we are looking at the rise of yobbing. I do not see how queer theory actually has any kind of analysis of actually the gay community connecting with the working class to actually, and we are looking at very, very serious challenges across Europe, etc., with the rise of the fascists, etc. I mean, Colin can correct me on that, but this is the problem I have. And I think that as gay activists and socialists, we have to bear in mind history does have a reverse gear, and we can't faff about, and these theories are very interesting, etc., but they're not taking me anywhere.
Sorry to the people that have indicated.
Hi, I'm Nancy Lindisfarne. I'm the co-author of the ISJ article that Jonathan mentioned. Jonathan always does the best stories, but he's not always necessarily as clear as he might be. And I wanted to actually come back and say something about this article, because I think it's useful, and I think it follows on from what Colin was saying in this marvelous talk. And it actually goes beyond where Judith Butler goes, and tries to say something quite systematic about the relationship between gender and society. And I think that picks up on what the comrade was just saying. What we're trying to do is to find an argument that explains social change, whether it's in reverse or whether it's going forward, whether it's gay marriage or whether we're looking at neo-fascism. And I think that's a very, very important thing that we have to do. The other thing we're trying to do in this article is actually say something about gendered violence, about oppression, about harassment, about all kinds of ways in which gender is enforced through violence. It's enormously important to understand. The argument is a very simple one. Like race, gender is used to divide rule by an elite. And they ratchet up this thing when they need somehow to actually create an inequality, and they relax it when there are people from below who are fighting for equality. What this means is, like race, they both work the same way, but perhaps then, as we're trying to argue, gender is more intimate and deeper and more effective and more widespread from the beginning of history. But wherever it is, violence is enormously important. So what we're starting from is actually a materialist argument. It is one that starts with class and a ruling elite that uses this device to actually enforce the needs of capital. So when there are changes in the modes of production, the elite then changes what happens with gender to actually respond to those needs of capital. It's a systematic argument, and it allows us to actually look at the economy, look at political economy, and put gender and race, indeed, in that place.
Okay, Colin.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by coming back on Jonathan and Nancy, and it's quite possible I don't understand the argument that they're putting, and we should go and read the article that they've written. But as I understand what they're saying, is that they're saying that the ruling class uses ideology around gender so as to foster division in society. And I think that at one level it's a materialist theory because it acknowledges class division, but it isn't a material theory in that it's like the ruling class here is self-consciously promoting ideology, and I don't think that's how ideology works. I mean, I think that if you actually look at the roots of attitudes to women in pre-class societies in this country, then what you see is that it is rooted in the need to transmit property. Dr. Johnson, the 18th century Tory, said in conversation with his mate Boswell, "On the chastity of women all the property in the world depends." And what he means by that is that if women have sexual autonomy, then they will go foisting bastards on their husbands and property will not be securely transmitted. At this point, Boswell suggests that it's all right for women to have affairs then when they're already pregnant, which you know, Johnson is outraged by because he didn't mean that. You know, so I think you can see, because what's interesting about capitalism is that before capitalism, of course, property transmission is important to the ruling class, but actually property transmission is also important under feudalism to subordinate classes, to the peasantry, because the only way, with the exception of the very poorest layer of peasants, the way that peasant economy works is that there is a sexual division of labour, and by and large men are out doing work in the fields and women are doing work around the home. You have to have a married couple so as to form a successful peasant household, and getting a dowry and inheriting goods and so on is central to all of that. So it seems to me that these ideas around gender are rooted much more directly in materiality than, if I understand them, Jonathan and Nancy are suggesting. About the word queer, I think people's experiences vary between, to be honest, different parts of the working class, from Stephen's experience in a university library and Merlin's experience in a sorting office. And I think that's part of the difficulty, that we're talking to different audiences here. And I think that on the one hand we have to have the debate, but you see, I'm involved in Queers Against the Cuts. I'm the co-convener, as it happens, of Queers Against the Cuts. I got involved in the group before it had been set up and the name had been decided on. It seems to me that the key arguments that I should be having within Queers Against the Cuts is that we should be an active group, is that we should be getting our banner on demos. You know, I spoke at the People's Assembly because of being co-convener. That we shouldn't be doing sort of bureaucratic stuff through trade union committees, that we shouldn't be having endless discussions about the form of the Constitution and so on, which is a tendency that exists there. That those arguments about activity are the key arguments that we should be having, and that while we have them, we can then start to raise issues, perhaps about what the group could be called. But to be honest, I don't see that as the central focus. I think that it would be, unnecessarily divisive to raise that. But that I think these are issues that we have to address more generally. In terms of gay marriage, somebody mentioned the attitude that queer activists take to this. I think it's absolutely right that we have to break with particularly some American queer activists whose approach is that they oppose the campaign for gay marriage because they say this is about buying people off and incorporating them. It's that argument about assimilation that I mentioned. I think we have to have a different approach, which is to say that the movement towards formal legal equality is a step forward. It opens up a space. It opens up a space, I think, in particular for the middle class layer that I talked about, because if you can buy yourself out of the rest of gay oppression once you've got formal legal equality, then that's all you want, really. But I don't see that people who don't want to marry and who reject marriage. There's a long tradition in the socialist movement of rejecting marriage, of not seeking to involve the state in your relationships. I feel very sympathetic to that, but I don't see that those of us who take that view are harmed by the introduction of marriage, because I think it opens up a space rather than rather than restricting a space. In terms of the ideas which dominate, I mean, someone mentioned Silvia Federici, and I went to the Historical Materialism Conference, which is an academic conference, at times very academic, run by a group of Marxists before Christmas. And what I thought there is that what you're seeing is, on the one hand, an enthusiasm for people who are Marxists to talk about women's oppression and how we take these issues forward, but also an overwhelming acceptance that Marxism is unable to account for oppression around gender and sexuality, and therefore we have to import non-Marxist ideas in order to do that. Now, I think that that's not the case. I think that the kind of accounts that I gave and other speakers have been giving through the meeting indicates that the kind of analysis that we have around the family, starting from the book Origin of the Family that Engels wrote in the 19th century, can actually do that. But I think that there is a bit of a desire, particularly given the low level of class struggle and industrial struggle that we're seeing. I think there is a bit of a desire for people to feel, let's just, drop all our differences. These issues aren't really important. Let's just kind of huddle together. And if the price of that is fudging things a bit, well, that's not really a problem. Now, I think we have to be clear that we want to work with people, and we welcome the fact that these debates are happening, but it actually is a problem. If we fudge all of these issues and say, well, we're all on the same side, aren't we? And it doesn't really matter, because I think we will inevitably come back to the issue about, well, is the problem capitalism or is the problem straight people? Are we looking to the working class for liberation, or are we looking, or are we looking somewhere else? I think that some of the books that have been written as part of these debates, I mean, I think that, Lisa Fogel's book, I don't agree with her point of view about Engels, but I think a great deal of what she has to say is extremely interesting. I think Heather Brown's book about Marx on gender and the family is extremely important in stressing that these are matters of considerable importance to Marx, and that there are references throughout Capital to the social position of women. He writes his anthropological notebooks about the social position of women, among other questions. So that from the beginning, Marxism is a politics which is about the liberation of humanity, that we have to reject a kind of Stalinist caricature of Marxism which says that it's just about economics, or it's just about the workplace and so on. We look to the working class as the key force that can change society, but that's so that we can liberate, that's so we can liberate everybody. I mean, two final points. The speaker touched on the experience of bisexual people, and I think this is really a sort of, it's a good example of the kind of way that people's sexuality is alienated. My experience, or talking to friends of mine who are bisexual, they say, there was a male friend of mine said, whenever I'm going out with a woman, people think I'm straight. Whenever I'm going out with a bloke, people think I'm gay. And there isn't that recognition of bisexuality, or people are called on to get off the fence and so on, and so forth. I think that what we're looking for is a society where the gender of people you desired would not be socially significant. And you have to come back to the experience of the working class in this country to finish off. And I think that when Thatcher died, we had a meeting in central London, and I think that one of the most important things, as the first speaker, Alan Kenny, was saying, is that what Thatcher wanted to do was to turn the clock back, turn the clock back in the sense of attacking the working class, but also to turn the clock back on all of the social gains that had been made in the 1960s. And they did that through Clause 28, through telling people that that they couldn't talk about homosexuality in schools. You look at America, Reagan, who now seems to be, there's this kind of, Reagan apparently is loved after his death. Reagan was a murdering bastard who did not speak about AIDS until tens of thousands of Americans were dead. But they lost. We were able, in this country, through socialist politics, through the involvement of the NUM, to actually beat them back. So we're now in a position where virtually every union has LGBT groups, where it is accepted as part of the common sense of the labour movement, which, as people have said, wasn't the case in the past. And I think that arguing for working class unity is absolutely important. We have to appreciate the anger that a layer of people feel about the continuing reality of gay and trans oppression. But we also have to reach out to the vast majority of workers. We have to reach out to straight workers and say, this is your struggle too, because it limits the ways that straight people can live their lives. It limits them because straight men and women are having to think, is that everybody is kind of policing themselves. How much affection can I express for my friends if I'm not to be thought a puff? And so these are things which distort and limit everybody's lives, whether we're LGBT or straight. So we have to unite and fight, and the way that we do that is on the basis of Marxism and class politics.